All right, it is about time for your latest piping hot monthly Bitcoin digest. We're going to cover two main topics today. One, we're going to take a quick look at what's been happening with the Bitcoin ETFs that have rolled out in the US. Take a look at the resulting supply and demand dynamics of Bitcoin. And then secondly, and dare I say in all its cringy glory, Bitcoin Season 2 appears to be heating up. We've got all sorts of stuff happening with layer 2 proposals. I'm going to spotlight one in particular today that's been getting a ton of attention on Twitter and elsewhere in the community, and that is Citrea. So we've got a lot to cover, a lot to unpack. Let's jump in. Okay, so first reflecting on some of the ETF stuff. And again, those of you that have watched my channel for a while, you know that I am never going to recommend going out and buying the ETFs when you could buy the real thing. When you buy the ETF, you do not have the real thing, but it is nonetheless interesting to stay on top of what is happening, not necessarily for the purpose of predicting any short-term price fluctuations and movements, right? This is not a trading channel, nor are you likely to be successful if you try your hand at that. But I do think, and I'm just speaking personally, that it adds a degree of urgency when you look at what is happening. And so as we can see here, the ETFs continue to suck up Bitcoin supply. IBIT, which is the BlackRock version of this, is in the top 5 in year-to-date flows, meaning it has taken in more cash than basically every other ETF in existence. And that includes really notable ETFs, as you can see, number 10 here, the QQQ. So that is absolutely bananas, right? And as Eric says, not bad for 17 days old. And so while we had a little bit of a sell-off, and this can probably be attributed to a little bit of sell the news, a little bit of net selling from the likes of GBTC, although a lot of the GBTC selling came back into one of the other ETFs. You had FTX selling a lot of its stuff as part of its bankruptcy claim. And who knows where price goes from here. But at least so far, these ETFs appear to have a lot of staying power. It is not the case that they're just falling off a cliff. There was this initial interest and that they're going away. So I think this starts to, not definitively, but starts to solidify the idea that these really are just these like passive buyers of Bitcoin, similar to a MicroStrategy, right? So the question that you got to start asking yourself as an individual or as a family stacking sats is like, what is your stacking plan given that we now are going to have the equivalent of multiple other MicroStrategy stacking? And so we can take a look at this visual here, which for me, I think really hammered this home. So of course there's GBTC, which is still the humongous sort of whale on this list, even though they are losing share relative to the others for a variety of reasons. Then you see the MicroStrategy block, but the new Bitcoin ETFs are already basically equaling MicroStrategy and will likely flip that in the next couple of days. Okay, and again, it's been less than a month. So like, try and kind of process that. Speaking of MicroStrategy, they continue to stack relentlessly. We can see that they have acquired an additional 850 Bitcoin, now holding 190,000, which is just absolutely bonkers. And perhaps even more importantly, they are now entirely repositioning their company as a quote Bitcoin development company. And you can see just how silly MicroStrategy has made other stocks look since adopting their Bitcoin strategy. And so this illustrates an incredibly important and vastly underappreciated part of the overall network effect of Bitcoin. The more skin in the game you tend to accumulate, the more immersed you become in championing and even actively developing and contributing to the advancement of Bitcoin, right? You really don't see that same incentive set elsewhere. Just on a personal level, for example, you know, I talk to fellow entrepreneurs, I talk to fellow content creators, educators, developers, who as they acquire more skin in the game in Bitcoin, they're like, I need to devote ever increasing shares of my working time to advancing this thing. And these are some of the smartest people that I've met, right? Like, sure, yes, there's a lot of, for example, Tesla fanatics who buy the stock and, you know, are championing it and doing podcasts on it and this and that. I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all elsewhere, but it's really not the same given that Bitcoin is this open system. It's in many ways permissionless, that you can build things on top of it, that you can build companies around it. You can use it in different ways. So I just wanted to hammer that home as yet another facet of all of this that really, I think a lot of people don't often think about. So the ETFs are stacking like crazy. They're about to surpass Microstrategy. Microstrategy is still stacking like crazy and has rebranded to a Bitcoin development company. Another big slice on that chart is, of course, Tether, who recently made bigger quarterly profits than Goldman Sachs. Okay, let that sink in, right? A Bitcoin and crypto native entity like Tether is now doing bigger profit than the sort of gold standard in the traditional finance world. And furthermore, they've had the result of this audit now revealed. So this was an audit conducted by BDO, which offered a pretty comprehensive analysis of their financial standing. But there have been a lot of people that have fudded Tether. And so you have to imagine at least a lot of those concerns are now quieted with the release of this auditing outcome. And it basically shows that they have, over 2.8 billion in Bitcoin holdings. They're continuing to park a portion of their quarterly profits into Bitcoin as a reserve. And so again, they're going to be stacking hard. And so just to put a double underscore on what Tether is doing, right? They have a lot of US treasuries that they use as a key component of their reserves that are backing the stablecoin USDT. And so they're earning huge sums of income in interest payments from the US government, part of which they're then taking and putting into Bitcoins. That's a pretty massive cheat code. And so again, Tether is basically printing money at this point by virtue of the huge store of US treasuries they have. And then coupled with their other business activities and revenue lines, they are able to continuously push a portion of that into Bitcoin every single quarter. So that's on the demand side. Of course, on the supply side, we are imminently coming up to the next halving event. That'll be sometime mid-April at this point. And just reflect on the fact, for those in particular who might be newer to Bitcoin, just keep in mind that in past cycles, the halving really is the event that creates the conditions for the bull run to really kick off. And so once you establish that supply side environment, and there's always a lagged effect, right? So the halving happens, and then it takes time, typically six or so months, for the impact of that to really kind of flow through. Keep in mind that also, meanwhile, since 2020, we have seen an unprecedented trend, which is supply leaving big exchanges, particularly Coinbase. That's never happened. And again, I know that some of that data is imperfect, so I don't want to overemphasize that, but at least directionally, something wild is happening there. And so just keep in mind that in prior cycles, we've had that explosive price action with much less supply tightness as well as demand in terms of these big entities that are now stacking. And oh, by the way, let's just go ahead and add gasoline or potential gasoline to the fire. Powell, many of you will have seen, recently came out and said the quiet part out loud. He basically said verbatim that the US is on an unsustainable fiscal path. Obviously, we all know that, but to hear someone like Powell saying that just in the mainstream is pretty crazy. We see the banking system looking shaky once more with the New York Community Bank Corp. We see a lot of evidence of emerging contagion around commercial real estate. China's looking rough. So it's a US election year. So there is just no way that we do not see additional stimulus, some sort of sneaky re-injection of liquidity. Again, it's going to be called something different. It's not going to be called QE. With the Bank Term Funding Program being expired, is it going to be some sort of new construct there? Or are they going to let things just sort of crash and burn? If they do, the response will be swift and COVID-like, if not bigger. And so you couple all these things together, demand stacking, tight supply, the macro conditions looking imminent for some sort of reinjection of liquidity. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but let's call it sometime this year, especially heading into an election year. And so while near term, I fully expect price to be pretty choppy, flattish, whatever. Once this cycle really gets going, and once you start to really have price rip, and now all of a sudden, a lot of different entities have much easier access to FOMOing in to Bitcoin, right? Previously, you were like, oh, I got a FOMO, I got to get a Robinhood account, or I got to get a Coinbase account. Again, a lot of this is US centric, but you get my point. Now it's like I have an existing brokerage account and I can just press 2 buttons and, buy an ETF, right? Again, I'm not advocating any of you watching to do that, to buy the ETF when you could just buy real Bitcoin. And importantly, withdraw that to your secure self-custody. If you're curious about how to do that, I have a whole bevy of different tutorials on this channel, but I'm just saying, medium to longer term, I'll leave it to you to decide where you think this is going to go. And again, for me at least, it just increases the urgency of reaching some of my stacking goals before price starts to get too far away for you to make meaningful progress. Again, every sat is precious. As I end every video, I say every sat counts, and I really do mean that, but the time is now. Final note on this topic before we move on. While a lot of what we've discussed is very bullish, this is not to say that there are still no headwinds, right? There are still all sorts of regulators and bureaucrats reaching their dirty hands into our business, right? You had the Biden declaration that miners need to report all sorts of stuff about what they're doing with Bitcoin mining. The Elizabeth Warrens of the world continue to screech. Okay, getting off my soapbox, let's transition now to the next topic for the day, and that is all the different L2 activity that is now starting to swirl around. Okay, so I mentioned the term earlier, but for those of you that have not seen the admittedly cringy term Bitcoin Season 2 thrown around, it's this idea that particularly with ordinals, and like them or not, ordinals really did move the needle on developer interest, on interest coming back into Bitcoin for other use cases beyond just these sort of pure monetary transactions. And a lot of you watching, I know, and I fall in this camp personally, view Bitcoin as money. Like that is what Bitcoin is. But there are other things, right? Like DeFi, as terribly besmirched as that term has become with all the scams that are out there, like there is real value in that. There is real value in being able to conduct more complex financial transactions, maybe borrowing Bitcoin for a project, right? Or an entrepreneurial endeavor or a business or whatever it is. And being able to do that as trustlessly as possible or as trust minimized as possible. I think there is great value to something like that. And again, you're going to have a lot of speculation as part of that on different tokens and different things like that. But like for hyper Bitcoinization to happen, make no mistake, you need things like DeFi. Like you just need it. And so given that for any sort of complex, modern society to operate on a fundamentally Bitcoin standard, you therefore need things like DeFi on Bitcoin. Now, there are a host of existing solutions that enable that in different ways. And I've covered a lot of these solutions on this channel if you would like to take a look. There's a whole playlist, in fact, dedicated to these additional use cases and proposals and things like that. So I've covered things like the Liquid sidechain, which is a federated sidechain to Bitcoin, has very nice privacy properties, and you can do quite a lot of stuff, different, asset issuance, token issuance, if that's your thing. There's also Sovereign, the Sovereign ecosystem, which is built on the Rootstock merge mine sidechain to Bitcoin. There's things like RGB, which have this client-side validation paradigm. So a very different design set and choice relative to a sidechain, to where you can do all sorts of interesting stuff there. Sovereign has started to come out with its Bitcoin OS, which is sort of the mother of all L2s. Again, we're using L2 rather loosely here. Like the Lightning Network in many ways is an L2. But it's a peer-to-peer L2 that enables payments, but it doesn't enable DeFi or anything to that effect. And so let's talk about some of the buzz that's happening right now around something called Citrea in particular, which leverages BitVM. And so let's break down a couple of these pieces, particularly if you're newer to this discussion. And again, if you're listening to this and you have absolutely no appetite whatsoever to use any of these things, that's actually okay. These things will still benefit you in the same way as ETFs are gobbling up Bitcoin supply. These different L2s are going to do the exact same thing and just increase the demand for Bitcoin, the asset, right? And so what's particularly notable about something called BitVM is that it enables Turing complete smart contracts without any changes to Bitcoin as it exists today. That is humongous. It was believed that that was not possible. It was believed that we would surely need some additional soft fork that either introduced new opcodes or operation codes so that we could do more things with native Bitcoin script, which is the programming language of Bitcoin. And so in October 2023, Robin Linus introduced BitVM. And the idea is that there are things called logic gates. This is how computers work. Computers have all sorts of different logic gates that take binary inputs, so zeros and ones. They do stuff with that input and then they produce an output. And that is like the atomic mechanism of computers. And there is a special logic gate called a NAND gate, which can be used to create whatever other type of logic function. And so in a nutshell, BitVM is the discovery of a way to use these NAND logic gates and represent them using native Bitcoin script as it exists today. And again, this is a big deal. An enormous reason or justification for Ethereum's original kind of existence was the ability to have Turing complete smart contracts. Turing complete basically means that you have the ability to solve an arbitrary problem. You'll hear the term composability, programmability thrown around as well, that sort of all kind of relate to the same idea of the breadth of class of problem that your computation can solve for. And so while it's still very early, and again, I'm not going to go into the gory depths of BitVM in today's video, but what it does lay the foundation for are a variety of what are called rollups. So the way to think about a rollup, so Bitcoin base chain, right? This is the blockchain we all know and love. Bitcoin is both the data availability layer in the sense that every Bitcoin node running is agreeing on the version of truth, the right set of data that represents this ledger that is the Bitcoin blockchain. And so other programs like Rollups can reference that data on the Bitcoin blockchain. And it's also the settlement layer in the sense that every node is verifying every transaction as well that settles on it. So a rollup is like an execution layer that can read the state of Bitcoin, so it can read data from the Bitcoin blockchain, do some computation off chain, and then return some data to the Bitcoin blockchain in a way that is verifiable. And the way these rollups do this is through some sort of proof. And so there are different flavors of rollups, but one of the really big differentiators between a rollup and something like a sidechain is that they arguably move the needle in a positive direction on trust minimization as it relates to the peg. And so what is the peg? The peg is basically me moving Bitcoin into or out of these different alternative structures, whether it's a sidechain, right? In the case of Liquid, I peg my BTC into Liquid. I receive a one-to-one match of that on the other end called LBTC or Liquid BTC. I can then do all this stuff on the sidechain that I may want to do with LBTC, and then I can peg out at the end of that process. But here's where there's a difference. That peg out process, at least in the case of Liquid, which is a federated sidechain, means that I am basically asking for permission to a quorum of signers. And that quorum literally is holding that initial Bitcoin in a multisig, in an M of N multisig. So there are M participants, typically the majority, of N total participants that are required to sign for you to peg your Bitcoin out, right? So there is absolutely a trust assumption there that you need to have an honest majority of signers. Now, we could go into the incentives and say, well, they're not incentivized to be dishonest. Like, there's still an assumption there, right? And so what something like a rollup can enable is instead of that M of N trust assumption, it is more like a 1 of N, meaning if there is any singular honest actor or verifier, signer, whatever we want to call these things, validators, whatever, as long as there's one honest actor, you're good. And so that is arguably a much better trust assumption in that case than in the other. And there's arguably an even more trustless option. This would be kind of the ultimate trustless holy grail of bridging, which would require some sort of new opcode. So this would require some sort of a soft fork. So again, I don't think we're going to have this anytime soon, but you would have some sort of ability to natively verify these proofs on chain so that you as an individual could unilaterally exit this rollup, and that would be quite powerful as well. But even as it is, this already moves the needle in a pretty significant way. And these rollups benefit from the full security of the underlying Bitcoin blockchain. They benefit from the full data availability, and they themselves have what's called global state, meaning that you can create all sorts of interesting apps, things like DEXs, decentralized exchanges, right? Imagine being able to swap different assets. Maybe you're living in Argentina right now and you actually denominate a lot of your life in US dollars because that's a lot more stable than your local currency, but you also have your long-term Bitcoin savings, and being able to swap those different assets without a trusted intermediary is a really powerful thing. And so that gets us to Citrea. Citrea made a huge splash this week by claiming themselves as the very first ZK rollup on Bitcoin. And there have been different summaries flying around. There's a pretty good interview that Jake Brown did with the co-founder of Citrea. If you want to listen to this from his own words, I would highly recommend that. And then there's also a variety of explainer threads that have come out, the best of which is probably this one from Bob Bodley. And as he is rightly noting here, some of the marketing to this I do think is a bit extravagant. This is not a perfectly trustless ZK rollup for the reasons that we just described, right? You still need this kind of one of n trust assumption. And so as Bob is saying, this is more like an optimistic rollup. What the word optimistic there means is that you're optimistically verifying this, meaning you're assuming that the different transactions that are happening on Citrea on this rollup are valid. And only when you believe something is not valid do you actually go and verify it. And I know that sounds crazy, but just know that these proofs are mathematical, right? You can always prove whether something is true or not with these proofs. And the optimistic part just makes it a lot more efficient so that you're not necessarily verifying absolutely everything, but you can at any time verify anything that you want. So as we can see, they would have somewhat wrapped version of BTC, I guess, right? This CBTC. This is what you would use to pay fees within the ecosystem. So again, conceptually similar to something like Liquid. And then what's interesting here is the proof data is being stored like an inscription. So there's this bundle of transactions that could be happening on this rollup. All of that is being used in CBTC, i.e. it is denominated all in Bitcoin. And then the proof data of those different transactions is being inscribed onto the Bitcoin blockchain so that you could always come and yourself verify the current state of the Citrea rollup using simply Bitcoin. And there's a lot of other details here about some of the other nuances to how this works. I would invite you to take a listen to that interview. It is quite good. And so the punchline to this is that do your own research, right? Don't take headlines at face value. It is clear that this is not a perfectly trustless true ZK rollup, similar to what we see in Ethereum land or wherever, but it is a meaningful step forward in many ways, as we explained earlier. And from what I can see and tell, this is a legit team. And that's important because there are a lot, and there will be more scam L2s for sure this cycle. So you gotta be really, really careful out there. You gotta be doing your own due diligence. I'm gonna be trying to cover these different L2s as best I can as well on the channel. So if you are not subscribed, you definitely want to be. But this is significant. This is meaningful. And again, even if you're listening to this, you're like, man, I just could care less. It is still good for you, oh hodler. It is still good for you, oh spend and replacer. There is a ton of developers coming back to Bitcoin, capital coming back to Bitcoin. And again, you could say we don't want that VC scam money. And again, while a good number of these efforts are going to crash and burn, there will no doubt be some of these projects that go on to be truly valuable contributions to the Bitcoin ecosystem. And particularly with this model of BitVM, which allows us to do some of this stuff without making any changes to Bitcoin, that is a huge deal. But it also opens up other implications. As I was alluding to earlier, the proof data is being published in inscriptions. And while they've been as efficient as they can be, and proofs themselves are quite efficient, they're also reasonably sized. Like, To call this amount of data as negligible would not be to characterize this appropriately. And so while there is a role to rollups in scaling Bitcoin block space, and that's super important, and I do think that is the net effect, it's not necessarily to say that like, oh, all of a sudden, fees are, right? Like, it remains to be seen exactly how some of those dynamics play out. And then again, it remains to be seen even in the case of Citrea. I picked them because it was the buzz of the town, this week. And I do think they're doing some really interesting stuff. But it also remains to be seen with that solution in specifically, right? We don't even have anything on testnet. They're doing this all pretty closed at the moment with the promise of open sourcing it as we go on. Again, that's how most projects do this, even open source projects that we now know and love. And so again, like it or not, things are ratcheting up. I have never seen this amount of enthusiasm. We have investors reaching out to us at Jolts. For those not familiar, I'm a co-founder of a company called Jolts. We do Bitcoin rewards as a service. So again, we're focused primarily on Bitcoin, Lightning, but we're also doing some Taproot asset stuff now based on demand we have from our customers. And so I can tell you on the ground, as a builder, as an entrepreneur, things are changing and they are changing fast. It is a great time to be building a Bitcoin company. It is a great time to be stacking and hodling sats. It's a great time to be stacking and spending your sats and replacing them. Wherever you fall in this spectrum, it is a great time to be involved in Bitcoin. And so again, I am trying to bring the very best mix of educational content as well as accompanying tutorials to be able to use the tools for the knowledge that we're gaining as we go along the way. I just did a great video on node comparisons. If you want to run a Bitcoin node, check that out. I've done videos on acquiring Bitcoin, securing it, running a node, accepting Bitcoin for your payments, you name it. So be sure you're subscribed because there's a lot yet to be written about all the L2 stuff. There's Sovereign's Bitcoin OS I'm going to be covering. Citrea, as we just spotlighted. There's Merlin chain. I mean, these things are coming out of the woodwork. And I'm also going to be working on a host of other tutorials in the coming month or so on things like the Aqua Wallet, Cashew, and some other exciting stuff as well. We're going to take a look probably in the next monthly digest at some of what is happening in the world of mining as we approach ever closer to the next halving. So you are not going to want to miss any of it. But I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on any of the topics we covered today, either some of the ETF and demand supply related stuff, or Citrea, BitVM, some of these interesting things that are happening as it relates to L2s. Let me know in the comments down below. But I hope you found this valuable and insightful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like. Use the share feature underneath this video. That really does help get this to a broader audience. And if you were so enamored with this content, you want to donate some sats, which really does help this pleb continue to make these videos, you can do so in a number of different ways. If you happen to have something like the Get Alby browser extension, you can just click that bad boy when you're on my YouTube channel, and it'll automatically detect that you are there and send some sats that way, which is pretty cool. Or alternatively, you can send some sats to my Lightning address. My custom one is me@www.ianmajor.xyz. I do think there are some issues with that currently that I'm taking a look at. So if you have any issues with that, you can always use ragermajor@getalby.com. Or I've got a QR code here if that is just easier to scan. And for those of you that want some additional handholding, that want some one-on-one mentorship, that want to talk through some of these questions in more detail, right? Running a node, connecting it with Sparrow Wallet, doing coin joins, multi-sig, hardware wallets, any of that stuff, you can reach out to me on Vita. Just go to vita.page/IanMajor. Vita is a great platform. We can even set up a video call and talk through and hash out those different questions. But we'll go ahead and leave all this here. As a reminder, every sat counts. And until next time, my friends, I'll see you then.